I am not going to be discussing Trump in this blog. I have voted, and it was fairly easy this time to vote early in Tennessee. It only took about 20 minutes. I'm going to discuss in this post Treasury inflation protected securities and IBonds that can be bought from the Treasury. Tomorrow, October 24, the Treasury will auction the 5-year Treasury inflation protected note, which I will just shorten in this discussion to TIP. The real yield on the 5-year TIP rose today by 7 basis points to close at 1.82%. The real yield is what the investor receives over and above the inflation rate for the note's term. The principal amount of the TIP is adjusted for inflation, and the coupon is applied to the adjusted principal amount when calculating the 6-month interest payments made every 6 months. The break-even inflation rate for the 5-year TIP closed today at 2.23%. It is called the break-even rate since that is the annual average CPI over the next 5 years for the 5-year TIP buyer to outperform the buyer of the 5-year non-inflation protected Treasury, which closed today at 4.05%. Just subtract the real yield from the nominal yield, and that is the break-even inflation rate. If you thought that inflation would be higher than the break-even inflation rate, and you're going to buy one or the other of these securities, then you would go with a TIP in a retirement account. I view the TIP as more of a protection against higher than expected inflation like the U.S. recently experienced. I'm already extremely heavy into Treasury bills, corporate investment grade corporate bonds, and municipal bonds that have no inflation protection at all. I will buy TIPS in my Roth IRA account either at auction or in the secondary market. I use a ladder approach in buying TIPS and have a constant flow of maturities between early 2025 and out to the early 2030s. I will not now buy TIPS that mature at 2035 or later. I view the 5-year TIP as an alternative to the IBond. The primary reason is that the IBond redemption prior to 5 years will result in a forfeiture of 3 months in interest, but redemptions after the expiration of that period will receive all of the interest that had been accrued prior to the redemption of the IBond. The IBond adjusts the coupon payment by CPI every 6 months and has most of the time paid a fixed rate that stays the same until the bond is redeemed or matured. The IBond fixed rate is the real yield equivalent to the real yield in the TIP, which simply means I would define it as the yield above the inflation rate. A purchase of an IBond before November 1st will have a fixed rate of 1.3%, lower than the real yield of the 5-year TIP that will be auctioned tomorrow. The Treasury will reset the fixed rate for 6 months after that, starting, I think they start on November 1st, and for the next 6 months, anything purchased during that period would have the reset rate, the new reset rate established by the Treasury. And that reset rate may change or remain unchanged it won't be going up, in my opinion, from the current 1.3%. So the 5-year tip bought at auction tomorrow will generate a higher annual average return than the IBond bought on the same day. That is one reason why I prefer buying the tip compared to the IBond. An IBond cannot be sold for 1 year after purchase. The tip can be sold at any time after purchase. The Treasury market is very liquid. I've never had any difficulty in selling a Treasury. 3 of my brokers do not charge a commission for Treasury trades, either at auction or in the secondary market. And those brokers are Fidelity, Vanguard, and Schwab. I have traded tips in my Roth IRA account, mostly very long maturities where I've clipped profits fairly quickly. They can fluctuate wildly in price based on movements in the nominal Treasury yields for the same maturities. I've also eliminated tips that had been bought at auction that had real yields when I purchased the tips, like maybe 1.9% or 2%. But there was a period when the real yield for tips went significantly into negative territory, and I was able to sell, for example, 3 tips that would have matured in 2019, and I sold them in, I think it was 2012. I have a snapshot in my blog for over an $800 profit. And when the buyer, at the buyer's price that he paid me, the real yield was almost a negative 1%. So I don't buy tips when the real yield is negative, and if I own them, I probably will get rid of them to whoever is willing to accept them for a price that produces a negative real yield. The main advantage in owning an IBond is that, for me, is that accrued and unpaid interest is not taxed until the bond is redeemed or matures. That allows me to shift income tax recognition into a year where my marginal tax rate is lower. If a tip is owned in a taxable account, tax has to be paid on the inflation accretion to the principal amount, which is not received until the bond is sold or is redeemed. Paying tax on income that is not received in the year that I have to pay the tax is contrary to my investment religion. Earlier this week, I redeemed all of my IBonds that were bought in 2022. I think that's the right year, when there was no fixed rate at all. I was receiving only the coupon based on CPI. While I forfeited some interest since the redemptions were prior to the 5-year holding period expiring, I decided that I could use the money to defray living expenses and keep the same amount as I was receiving in those redemption proceeds in a brokerage account where I could earn more on a T-bill or bond or just about anything that I would buy. I did redeploy 1/5 of the proceeds to buy a new IBond yesterday that will have the 1.3% fixed rate, which is, of course, better than the 0 that I was getting for the IBonds that I redeemed. I will be publishing a new post tomorrow in my blog. I am continuing to reduce my stock allocation somewhere near $45,000 reduction this year. And we'll be discussing there $40,000 in principal amount of purchases of T-bills, 1 Tennessee municipal bond, and several short-term investment grade corporate bonds. I'm a very conservative investor.